These are the core objectives for the chapter. Please make sure that you review them as you're reading chapter 20. The antecedents of progressivism. These are some of the background things that are going on that really begin to make people think that there needs to be some reform in the government and the economic policies of the U.S. So one of the big things that we're going to see that has a huge impact on the progressive movement is the problems going on in the rural communities. Farmers had four major problems: the high cost of transportation, the high cost of taxes, low prices for their goods, and high interest rates. So when we are talking about the high cost of transportation, we're mainly talking about how much it costs to transport goods along the railroads. When the railroads first came to the rural areas, the farmers felt that these would be wonderful methods for them to use to get their farmers' goods to market. However, we see as the late 19th century progresses and we move into the early 20th century, we see that the railroads began to charge more for moving goods in rural areas than in more urban areas. We called this the long versus short haul abuse. The railroads argued that it cost more for them to run the trains in the rural areas because there were fewer people, fewer passengers, and fewer customers for their goods, and so they started charging high rates for that. And the farmers naturally feel upset about this because many of these railroads have been paid for with taxpayer money, and farmers paid the highest taxes because still we see that taxes are primarily property tax based. Leading to the next problem, the high taxes. We still have not initiated the income tax in the United States, so states and the federal government used property taxes as the main form of raising money. And when we're talking about property in the 19th century and in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, we are talking about actual property. Not today like stocks and bonds, we're talking about land. And so naturally, farmers have the most land, so they are paying the most property taxes. We also see beginning in the 1880s a huge reduction in prices for many farm goods. Some of this was caused by overproduction of farmers. They were producing simply more than could be absorbed by the market. And some of it was caused because of the high import taxes that we're charging to foreign countries. So that is limiting how much we can export to other countries. So to give you some examples, prior to 1880, the price of a bushel of wheat was about $1.20 a bushel. By 1895, a bushel of wheat was going for about 50 cents a bushel. So in about a decade and a half, you see a 50% reduction in the cost of wheat. The same thing with cotton. In 1880, cotton was going for about 10.5 cents a pound. By 1894, it is going for 4.5 cents a pound. So we're having about a 50% reduction in the price of goods for farmers. However, they're not seeing a 50% reduction in the transportation costs or their taxes. And so this, of course, is causing many farmers to go bankrupt. A fourth major problem for farmers were high interest rates. Farmers were and still are really considered to be a debtor group because oftentimes they have to borrow money in order to get their crops out, borrow money for not just to purchase land but also to purchase equipment, and they hope that they can make enough money on the crops that they can pay off all of their loans. That unfortunately does not always happen, and so they fall into a high risk category for banks and mortgage companies. And so farmers in the 1880s and 1890s were paying about a 15% interest on farm loans, and that is a very high interest rate which made it very difficult for them to make any money, even if they had a good year with their crops, with the low prices, and then all of the expenses, the high interest rate, the high taxes, the high cost of transportation. Farmers just were not making very much money. And so this is beginning to cause a fundamental flaw in the U.S. economic system, because farming is a major industry in the United States, and it is at this time our major export in the country, agricultural goods. So we began to see some farmers groups organizing to try to force the government, many starting on the state level, trying to get the state governments to do things to help the farmers, and so they can make more money. One of the major farm groups, and the most well-known of the farm groups, was called the Grangers. The Grangers really focused a lot of their attention on trying to get railroad regulation, and they have huge numbers in the Granger organizations in the rural populated states. And because of that, they are able to force some states to begin to make some state regulations against the railroads. Well, you can imagine the railroad companies are not going to appreciate that, and they are going to balk when some of the states begin to try to curtail how much they can charge for goods. One of the states that had placed some restrictions on railroads was Illinois. And one of the major railroad companies at the time brought a lawsuit against the state of Illinois, stating that they were a private company and it was therefore illegal for states to try to regulate these privately owned corporations. So this case becomes known as the Munn versus Illinois case, and you can imagine, because of its importance and the issue of can states regulate private businesses, it eventually made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in the Munn versus Illinois case in favor of the states. They said that, yes, railroads are private companies, but they are companies in which the public has an interest, meaning that not only did the public monies help to fund the building of some of the railroad tracks, which was true, but also railroads have become the major method of transportation in this country, transporting both goods and people. And so the public has an interest in railroads. And so the Supreme Court said, yes, you are privately owned, but you are a business that the public has an interest in. And the Supreme Court ruled that in the owners of property in which the public has an interest must submit to be controlled by the public for the public good. So what that means in everyday language is, even if you are a private company, if you are a company like a railroad or a major transportation company, then you must submit to public control. That you can't just charge what you want, you can't just do whatever you please, that you must submit to government regulation because it is for the public good. This is interesting in the late 1880s when this court case comes about, because we did not really have government regulation of business. Remember, this is still the laissez-faire economic times in the United States. And so the Supreme Court saying that the government can regulate these businesses is a huge move, because we did not have any type of government regulation of business at the time. Well, you can imagine the railroad companies were not pleased with this ruling, so they began to look at a way to try to get that ruling overturned. And so a few years later, they will file another lawsuit, but this time against government regulation of railroads, but this time approaching it from a different angle. This time, in the Wabash case, the railroad companies are stating that the states cannot regulate the railroads because the railroads are involved in interstate commerce. And that, of course, is true. And this time, the railroads will win. The Wabash case, the Supreme Court ruled that state regulations of railroads was unconstitutional because the Constitution states that only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. That's commerce between the states. So this time, the railroads will win. However, the public is still looking at the government to protect them. So now the government is going to have to look at a different angle of trying to protect the public from overcharging by the railroads. After the Wabash case, we see increased pressure put on the government, not just state governments, but also the federal government, to take some action to begin to regulate some of these big corporations, especially the railroads. So the first government regulation of business was the Interstate Commerce Act, which was passed in 1887. The Interstate Commerce Act created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which we more commonly refer to today as the ICC. Any business today that's involved in interstate commerce, it falls under the control of the ICC. In 1887, we are only looking at railroads that will fall under the control of the ICC. That under the terms of the Interstate Commerce Act, the ICC could issue orders of a corporation to stop an unlawful practice. And at this time, we're really looking at railroads. So what we're talking about is railroads charging more in rural areas than they charged in urban areas. They had to have uniform fees to charge. Another practice that the railroads had was giving rebates to what they called favored shippers. So the ICC could order a railroad to stop any of these practices. It looks like on paper that the Interstate Commerce Act is a step forward in regulating business, but what we see is even though Congress will pass this act and the president will sign it, President Cleveland, the federal government is very hesitant to enforce the Interstate Commerce Act, and we don't really see a lot of teeth from it. But it is the beginnings of government of regulation of business. A few years later, in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act stated that combinations which restrained trade were illegal, and any corporation that was found in violation of the act, quote, restraining trade, could be fined triple damages. What we're looking at with the Sherman Antitrust Act is people reacting against these huge corporations that are eliminating competition. And that's what they're talking about when they say restraining trade. So when you would have a corporation that would gain complete control of a market, that is basically creating a monopoly, which is illegal in the United States. And so what these big businesses have begun to do is call themselves trust. And so this was a way that they have been using to get around the anti-monopoly acts of the Constitution. So the Sherman Act says it doesn't matter what you call yourself. You can call yourself a company, a corporation, or a trust, but if you are restraining trade, if you are eliminating competition, you can be charged triple damages for these actions. Once again, the Sherman Antitrust Act looks very good on paper, but it will be really into the 20th century, really when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, before we truly enforce this act. It'll be about 20 years before the Sherman Antitrust Act is really enforced by the government. Another thing that we see happening that begins to lead us toward the progressive movement is the emergence of what we call the populist movement. The populist movement is an extension of the problems in the rural areas, a problem, the farmers' problems, and these early attempts to regulate big businesses, especially the railroads. And from that came the formation of a new political party, the Populist Party. The Populist Party really started in the western areas and some states in the South, and they were most popular in those western areas. Some of the things that the Populist Party stood for, some of the things in their platform, the term that we would use in government, was that they called for unlimited coinage of silver. Basically, what this is striving to do is to create inflation. In the 1880s and 1890s, the United States was on a bimetallic system, which meant that all of the money in the U.S. Treasury was backed up by gold and silver. And of course, silver was cheaper than gold. And so what the government had done to keep prices low, to curtail inflation, was they had created this formula for buying silver, a ratio, that they would buy so much silver in proportion to gold. And this way we could regulate how much money was in circulation. The farmers in the Populist Party want unlimited coinage of silver. They want the ratio to go away. They want the federal government to buy as much silver as the silver producers can bring to them, and that would then allow more money to be coined, and then that would mean that we would get a lot of money in circulation, which would create inflation. Now today, as consumers, most of us don't like inflation because that means prices go up. But if you're a debtor, especially a farmer whose prices have progressively been getting lower over the years, you would like inflation because that means the price of your goods would go up, which would make you make more money, and then you would be able to pay your bills better. So they want unlimited coinage of silver. Another thing that they want is direct election of senators. If you go back and remember from 1301, the senators were selected by their state governments. They did not stand for election among the people. And many people have begun to believe by the time we get to the 1890s that the Senate was corrupt, that they were in the pocket of big business. They did not have to worry about if their constituents at home were pleased with their work. And so they felt that this could be eradicated if the Senate had to stand before the population of their state and be run for election. And so they want direct election of senators. Another thing that we see that the Populist Party pushed for was nationalization of banks, railroads, and utilities. Now, what this means in more modern terminology is government ownership of the banks, railroads, and utilities. So that it is a form of what today we would call socialism. If the government owned all the banks, railroads, and utility companies. The idea from the Populists was that if the government owned and controlled those essential businesses in America, it would curtail some of the abuses of these big banks and railroads and the utility companies. Another thing that the Populist Party pushed for was an 8-hour workday. They did this mainly because they were trying to broaden their political base. They know they can't win national elections just by focusing on farmers' problems. And so they want to also focus on the problems of the working class, the people that are working, for an hourly wage. So they want the 8-hour workday that the unions had also been pushing for, that we talked about in a previous chapter. They also want a graduated income tax. They saw the income tax as a way of taking some of the pressure off of farmers who are paying these huge property taxes. And so if property taxes cease to be the only way that states and the federal government raise money, then it would be good for the farmers. And so they want a graduated income tax. Now, what a graduated income tax means is that you would pay a higher percentage of your income as your income went up. So if you made $50,000 a year, you might pay 10%. If you made $10,000 a year, you might only pay 3% of your income. So it's not that you just pay more, you pay a higher percentage. When we have today, if your parents do their taxes at home, ask them if you can look at the tax scales. You'll see that there are ranges that'll say between this income level and this income level, this is the range that you will pay. And so the graduated income tax was seen as a more fair way to tax people, not just making people that made more money pay more, but pay a larger percentage of what they made. An offshoot of the populist movement really was the progressive movement, and even though the progressive movement became much larger than the populist movement, it really began with that populist movement that we're talking about. So we see that down at the end of our slide where it talks about the antecedents, the things that helped lead to the progressive movement were populism, were the labor movement. And then one of the big things was that panic of 1893, that depression in 1893 really woke up the country and made us realize we need to make some changes to our governmental system so that the government can have a little more input and a little more impact on the economy. So who were the progressives? The progressives were reformers for social justice. Basically, these people are trying to make our society a better place to live for everyone, not just for the wealthy, but for the middle class and for the working class and for the poor people. And interestingly enough, most of the progressives came really from the middle class. And I think this is a very common thing that we see in democratic societies and in capitalist societies. Reformists often come from the middle class. And it's probably because from that middle, you can see the problems better. If you're in the upper class, there's nothing wrong as far as you're concerned. You're making lots of money, you're living the good life, so you don't want to change anything. If you're from the lower classes, you may be either overly critical of the wealthy, which we see sometimes happened, and that led to the communist movement in the early 20th century in Russia and China and some of those places. Or you may just be so bogged down in trying to work and make a living for yourself that you don't even think about, is there a way that I can change the world? But in the middle class people have some free time on their hands. They're from that angle where they can see problems in both above them and below them. And so the reform movements, especially in America, really usually do come from the middle class. Some of the goals of the progressives, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are just some of the major overarching goals of the progressive movement, is to have better working conditions. In the factories in America, as we were talking about in some earlier chapters, we see that the factories were unsafe, they were unsanitary, people worked 12, 14-hour days, very badly ventilated facilities. They often was very poor lighting. They weren't safety equipments on the machines, and so they felt that people deserve to have better working conditions, better pay for that long work that they were doing, 8-hour work days. Just in general, that just because you're poor and you're in the working class doesn't mean that you can be worked to death. Another thing that the progressives wanted was to abolish child labor. As we were talking in earlier chapters, that child labor became very popular as we became more industrialized. The problem with child labor is that it is both unhealthy for the child, because children that work in these factories often worked so many long hours that led to early death rates for them, or them getting childhood diseases like rickets, which was caused by a lack of sunlight, and it caused a bone disease for them. But child labor also creates a cycle of poverty, because if children are working and not going to school, then they don't ever have the opportunity to get out of that factory work. Another thing that the progressives pushed for was workmen's compensation. Now, this is something that is just, accepted in American society in the 20th and 21st centuries, but we don't see that before the progressive movement. And workmen's compensation, of course, is if you are injured on the job, then the company is responsible for taking care of your medical bills, providing for you when you're out, rehabilitating, and then keeping your job so that when you get well, you can come back to work. In the early ages of America, before the 1920s, if you got injured on the job, you lost your job, and the company did not pay your medical bills, and it caused all types of financial crises for the individual that was hurt on the job. Another goal of the progressives is they want to clean up the city slums. They're beginning to see the dangers in the overcrowding and the pollution, and they want to build better places for people to live, that are healthier places for them to live, and have people charged a more equitable rent for that inner city housing. And so they want to clean up the city slums. Another goal of the progressives is they want to clean up politics. This, they see that the laissez-faire economics has led to business lobby groups basically controlling some of our congressmen and senators, and they believe that the government needs to get back to working for the people, and we want to clean out these corrupt politicians and make the government work for the people again. And they want effective government regulation of big business. We've seen, some attempts with the creation of the ICC, the Sherman Antitrust Act, but they want those acts to be enforced. They want the government to truly not just pass legislation, but to truly enforce that legislation to make big business more responsible to the American public. A group that really helped to push forward the progressive agenda was the muckrakers. The muckrakers were writers and journalists who spread reform ideas in America. They engaged in this new type of investigative reporting, and their goal really was to dig down and find all of the nasty, disgusting, illegal, corrupt things about American government and American society, and then write about them. Either write newspaper articles or magazine articles or books. Write about these things. Reveal these things to American society, with the goal that then once Americans read about this, then they would be motivated to push for government change. Teddy Roosevelt actually kind of coined the term muckrakers, saying that these journalists were out raking the muck. Muck is that, if you clean up like a livestock pen, the muck is the garbage in the pen there. And so he said they're out raking the muck, raking the trash up, and exposing it into American society. Some prominent muckrakers, one was Ida Tarbell. She wrote a series of magazine articles entitled Shame of the Cities. This series really focused on Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller, and how Rockefeller had used power and government connections to monopolize the oil industry. Another muckraker was Frank Norris. He wrote The Octopus, which was about the Southern Pacific Railroad and how the Southern Pacific Railroad was controlling farmers in California, and the cost of using the railroads was just detrimental to those farmers in California. Henry George wrote a book entitled Progress and Poverty. This book basically uses the idea that increasing national wealth brings increasing poverty. He really focuses on how the divide between the rich and the poor is growing larger and larger in the United States, because we see during this age of industry, of course, we began to have our first millionaires and multimillionaires in American society. And he said basically the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. What he forgets to do in this book, Progress and Poverty, is also talk about, though, but there was also an increase in the middle class during this age of industrialization. Another muckraker was Henry Lloyd. Henry Lloyd wrote a book entitled The Wealth Against Commonwealth. This is talking about how these big corporations are using their power against the people. And The Wealth Against Commonwealth is one of the works that we use when we talk about these industrialists. Remember when we were talking about, were they captains of industry or were they robber barons? In Henry Lloyd's book, they would be considered robber barons, that they used their power to gain more wealth at the expense of the public. Two of the most famous muckraking authors, though, were Jacob Riis and Upton Sinclair. Jacob Riis wrote a book, How the Other Half Lives, and you can see in the slide there's a picture on a couple pictures. The first one in the upper left corner that shows the cover of the book. Basically, in his book, he is describing life in the slums of New York City. One of the things that we see with Riis's book that really sets it apart is he uses photography to not just write about life in the slums, but to actually show life in the slums. Riis was considered to be the first photojournalist in America. And so the idea is that a picture speaks 1,000 words. And so you can talk about, poverty, but these pictures, which you can see, there's about 3 different pictures there from the book, showing how these people are sleeping on the floor, sleeping out in the streets, and how utterly devastating this poverty is for these people. This book really brings home to the middle class that we need to make some of those reforms, like cleaning up the city slums. Because what had happened, of course, as the middle class had begun to grow and develop, they had moved out of the inner cities and moved more to the suburbs. So they had become more removed from the problems of the inner cities. And so this book is there to remind them that we have responsibility to help the poor in our society. Then Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. The Jungle exposed the unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry. The Jungle is interesting. Upton Sinclair was a socialist, and he actually wrote the book to try to bring attention to the blight of the workers and how the workers were abused by the big industry. And he focuses on the meatpacking industry because it's so huge at the time, and they used a lot of immigrant workers there. But in writing the book, he wrote a lot about what the workers went through and what the workers did at the meat plants. And it's a novel, but it was very true to life. And so he talked about how the meat wasn't properly inspected, and diseased animals often got by the inspectors, and there were no cleanliness standards in these meatpacking industries, and there were rats and flies and all of these things all over the place. And what people focused on more in his book were these unsanitary conditions in the meat plants rather than the blight of the workers. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, actually led to later legislation regulating the food industry, not just the meat industry, but the food industry in general. Another aspect of the progressive movement was something called the settlement house movement. The settlement house movement was something that Americans borrowed from Great Britain, actually. The settlement houses were usually in the inner cities of America, as they were in Great Britain. The first settlement house in the United States was created in Chicago. It was called Hull House, and it was created by Jane Addams. Jane Addams was a middle-class, college-educated woman, because as we moved into the industrial age, we began to see that it became more acceptable for women to become educated. And when Jane Addams finished her college degree, instead of getting married, she decided that she wanted to focus on helping in some of these inner city neighborhoods. What her house, Hull House, did, and then later settlement houses in other parts of Chicago and New York City did, was they tried to bring social services to these immigrant neighborhoods in the inner city. They provided things like child care, education, meals, showers, recreation. Child care was huge, because if your older children that are about 10, 11, 12 are working, then who's taking care of the little babies? Because the moms are working too. And so providing child care was very, very important. Education was extremely important as far as Jane Addams was concerned, because many of these immigrants did not speak English, so they're taught English, and then they're taught some fundamental things like reading and writing, with the idea that it can help to elevate their status in society, so maybe down the road they can get a better job. They provided a good hot meal. They are not a soup kitchen like we have today, and they did not provide permanent shelters for people living, on the streets. But if you didn't have a place to live, they did allow you to stay there for a few days, a few nights. They provided showers, because many of the tenement buildings did not have bathroom facilities and shower facilities, and so they provided a way for people to clean themselves by providing showers. And then they also believed that it was very important for the children in these inner cities to have an opportunity to just play. And there weren't a lot of public parks just yet. That's one of the things that the Jane Addams and her group will push for. But so the settlement houses would provide recreation facilities for the kids in these inner city neighborhoods. Jane Addams became a huge figure in the progressive movement, and a voice for the poor, and a voice for social services during this time. She campaigned for stricter building codes to bring these tenement houses up to safer standards, limiting how many people could live in the buildings, making sure that they weren't rat infested, providing fire escapes in the buildings. All of the standard things that we think about in buildings today were not in place, but she pushed for these stricter building codes. Better sanitation systems in the cities, because of course, as we talked about earlier in chapter 16 and 18, sanitation was an issue that caused huge problems in the cities, led to the spread of diseases, and so she pushed for better sanitation systems. As we were just mentioning earlier, she also pushed for cities and states to start to build more public parks, more green spaces, we would say today, in the cities, so that people could have an opportunity to just relax on the little bit of time that they had off. She also pushed for laws to protect women and children, because obviously in these poor inner city neighborhoods, women and children were often the victims of unscrupulous workers. They were often taken advantage of at work, or in these tenement buildings if their husbands got killed, those types of things. So she wanted laws to protect women and children. She wanted laws to protect them in the workplace and provide better salaries for them in the workplace. Another goal of the progressives was education reform, and we see a huge movement in education reform during the 1890s. Part of the concern with education reform came because of the concerns with child labor, and people were concerned that these children were working instead of going to school, and that the work was debilitating for the children and also creating this cycle of poverty. The progressives are going to start pushing for the states to have compulsory school attendance laws. Another thing that we see that oftentimes, though, the businesses also supported education reform because they also saw that schools could be a place to better train workers. And so we see that there's going to be a movement to even change some of the educational practices in American society. John Dewey wrote a book called The School and Society that was published in 1899 that really became kind of the blue book for education reform. He believed that the schools should be a place, yes, where children learn reading and writing and arithmetic, but they should also be a place for activity. He also believed in more student-directed learning, exploration in learning. And we began to see that between 1880 and 1920, that more states did begin to adopt mandatory school attendance laws where children had to go to school. Now, most of the time in these states, when they began to pass these mandatory attendance laws, children only had to go to school to about, what today would be like 7th or 8th grade. We're not looking at all the way to, age 18 when you graduate from high school today, but about 7th or 8th grade would be mandatory attendance. Once you get the mandatory attendance laws at the schools in those states, then we do begin to see child labor decreasing because the children have to go to school. We also begin to see the addition of kindergartens into the school and what we call age-graded elementary schools. Instead of having those big one-room schoolhouses, we began to see that schools would be divided by age and grade level. So when you're 6, you would go into 1st grade and you would learn these skills, and once you pass those skills, the next year when you're 7, you will go into 2nd grade and you'll have a new set of skills that builds on the skills from the 1st grade, very much like what we have today, of course. They also believed it was very important to have professionally trained teachers. Before this, what we had basically was teachers that just did what today we would call an internship. They went to school, they were a good student, then they came back and they worked with the teacher at that school and they became a teacher. But now they're going to have to go to college. They're going to be professionally trained to be a teacher. They also began to add vocational education. But today we would call this as career and technical education. Things like woodworking, carpentry, welding. Those would be vocational or technical education things. We also begin to see our PTAs, our parent-teacher associations, being added, school nurses, standardized elements in education where in order to move from one grade to the next, you have to master these certain skills. And so by 1899, by the turn of the 20th century, we do begin to see many of the elements of education that we have in our education systems today, because the education reform did get enacted because the progressives were pushing for it. One area that we see that the progressives did not do anything to help with, though, was civil rights for minorities, especially African Americans in our country. These reform ideas that they have, they do not extend to minorities. So it's important for us to look right now. We've used these terms before, but I want to kind of remind you. In the South, we had de jure segregation and de jure disfranchisement of African Americans, meaning by law, the races were separated in the South. By law, using things like literacy tests and poll taxes, African Americans were kept from voting. But in the North, we also see that African Americans were not extended full civil rights. they have what we call de facto segregation. The civil rights laws were not enforced. Segregation came about because people would not sell minorities houses in white neighborhoods, and so then that led to segregation in the schools. Oftentimes African Americans saw themselves limited in the jobs that they were offered or accepted to. They would not be accepted to certain colleges because they were African American. So it's not something that's the law, but it's in practice. So across the United States, we see that there are issues with minority rights in our country, and that will not be addressed really very fully by the progressive movement. Having said that, though, there were a couple of organizations that do come about during this time period that eventually will have some impact on helping with the civil rights movement. One of these was the Urban League. The Urban League was organized by Booker T. Washington in 1910. Its goal was to get better working conditions and living conditions for African Americans and to obtain civil rights for African Americans. In the Urban League, blacks and whites worked together to try to get better housing, better recreational facilities, and equal employment opportunities for African Americans. One of their big goals was that they wanted to break down the color barriers in labor unions. They wanted minorities to be able to join the labor unions. Unfortunately, most of the labor unions would not allow blacks to join with them, which may have been part of the reason that the labor unions were not very successful, because they're taking a whole huge portion of the working class out of the labor movement. Another group that organized during this time was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP came about because of the Niagara movement. W.E.B. Du Bois and some other black activists began meeting in 1905 in Niagara Falls. They actually had to meet in Canada, on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, because they couldn't get a room for their meetings in New York. And so they began to meet to discuss how we can obtain enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And the Niagara movement eventually joined with some other organizations, and it became the NAACP. And of course, the NAACP becomes one of the central civil rights organizations that moves us toward full enforcement of civil rights in the 1960s. But it gets us kind of a slow start, and it's seen as a little more aggressive than the Urban League. W.E.B. Du Bois was not as popular among American politicians as Booker T. Washington was, because Booker T. Washington was a little less aggressive in his tactics. But unfortunately, the progressive movement itself really didn't do much to help African Americans or other minorities in our country, but these two organizations do begin during this time period. That ends this section of Chapter 20. In the next section of Chapter 20, we are going to talk specifically about the progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, and very specific legislation that will be passed as a result of the progressive movement. So this is where we will end today, and then the next section will pick up with the presidents.